Well, we're going to continue to take a look at Stone Mountain before and during our conversations with Stephen and Robin, but I wanted to say something about Stephen, why I admire him so much, is that he's an author and a researcher into the mythic life and into shamanism. I call it shamanism. He likes to call it shamanism, and I guess he should know. He's the expert in it. But he has practical knowledge of these things. He's not a bookworm. Even though he's a college professor and an author, as you can see from the form, he's a hands-on guy too, and that's what makes his work so valuable. And I think it's also the kind of thing that attracted Joseph Campbell to him, who was also a Columbia athlete and a scholar. And Steve has that same combo, but Steve also has, I think, just won over Joseph in the sense that he went to these places to speak to shamans and to look at people who were experiencing the other half of life, the kind of life that our pre-literate ancestors experienced, that only can be accessed through shamanistic techniques. We're going to have him talk a bit about it now. I think you'll be amazed at his background. Let's talk about your books on mythology and shamanism and everything like that. That, in fact, I know that you're not just a guy who goes to the library and reads about it. So could you just tell us a little bit about your own experiences in shamanistic practices, as to what you sought out of them and as to what you gained and how broad it was compared to a real shaman, etc. Because you traveled quite a bit, didn't you?
I prefer the term shaman.
Shaman, okay.
It's from the Tungus language in western Siberia, and that's where the heart of shamanism is. And people have conjectured that there are more shamans around the Arctic and the North circumpolar region because it's like sensory deprivation. They dream so vividly, they imagine so vividly because the landscape is bare. There's probably some truth to that, but also those long winter nights, not much stimulation or paraphernalia. You don't have many props, and so shamans are mystics. They understand things before they happen. They understand the roots of people's illnesses. They go through a kind of a dark night of the soul, of death and rebirth. And I think I first started getting interested in it when I worked with Black and Hispanic populations as a psychiatric social worker. And these are people who saw spirits and did healing on each other all the time. And their little Santeria shops and bodegas were right around the corner, and I would interact with people who were mystics. Also, my father, as a Swedenborgian minister, attracted lots of Baltic peoples, Latvians, Estonians, Lithuanians, and they were a mystical crew. They were all seeing spirits. They were all doing healings with each other. I mean, they were really, and I was just fascinated. I just loved them. And the other thing that my father was interested in is as a Swedenborg member of the Swedenborg Foundation. He was one of the founding members of the modern version of the Swedenborg Foundation. He welcomed Chinese Taoists who were running away from Mao in the 1950s and 60s, and suddenly, if you were an aristocrat, if you were educated, if you had money, you were no longer welcome in China somehow, or you better get out or they could really do pretty bad things to you. And those people were in our home all the time, so I had a lot of experience of Taoists, and I heard stories and lore about Taoism. And I worked with South American shamans. I'm moderately good in Spanish and learned a little Portuguese, and I'm pretty good at most languages. So wherever I go, I look up the shamans, look up the mystics. We had a great time when we were in India and Sri Lanka, 1975-76, hanging out with shamans and learning dances and the masks of the masks and mandalas and healing ceremonies of Sri Lanka. So we spent a lot of time with the mystics in the places that we went. Robin was doing her PhD dissertation on ritual dance and temple sculpture and temple architecture and compounds. Maybe you want to talk about that?
Yes, I was focused more on the space than on the specific dance. But for instance, in Sri Lanka, of course they don't use the term shaman there. They're katadeos and babayeros, and they have other names for the musician healers and the dancing curing healers. But it's a wonderful, rich culture, and it's fascinating because here is a high culture that has been literate for thousands of years, and is a culture that constructs the architecture is exquisite, and it is an architecture based on this sense of the spiritual world being the architecture itself being an emanation,
Yes.
and a revelation of the world of spirit that's all around. So it's embedded in shamanism, or animism, as many people would say in that particular context. The animistic universe is there, and we're swimming in it. And then the architecture is this incredible stone manifestation of it. So in the dances and the movements and the healing ceremonies are all spring out of that ground. And of course you're in this incredible jungle place. So that was a wonderful place to look at the interfaces between all of these.
The actual spaces themselves
healing,
being conducive to it.
And also here are people who are a highly literate, highly civilized, cultured people, in the way that modern people can recognize, because I believe that these things have been very strong in many cultures we don't recognize, but certainly, Sri Lanka is considered a very high culture. So here they are with having almost lost their shamanic roots beneath the Buddhism, and then there's a recurrence of it. After the British have been there for a long time and they begin to take control of their own culture, there's a recurrence in the interest and a revitalization in the villages among people who are educated people. So this is something that we ran into that was fascinating.
So in fact, in the travels that you took, that in fact you went into areas where in fact the people believed, or they had put it in the back of their minds, but it soon came to the front, there was a spiritual life behind the physical life. Let me ask you this, that in the shamanic, is that how we say it? Mm-hmm. Your practices that you kind of bumped into in your travels, how much was done from a normal state of consciousness through, back through meditation, whatever it happens to be, like Joan basically just goes somewhere, or let's say Adora goes somewhere, and how much is done with plants and hallucinogens and that whole array that we read about in the popular literature?
The answer is yes.
Yeah. So it's all together. It's all one big thing.
All together.
And
sometimes
and dance, of course, too. Right.
Drum, dance.
Yeah.
Many shamans are into entheogens, is the term that we use now. Things that
Theogens.
Visionary vegetables.
Okay.
Vegetables that manifest the presence of God, you would say. And from our early times, Robin and I were able to order, whole peyote cactuses from places. It was legal back in the 1960s, where nobody was checking anyway, and you could order these boxes of peyote cactus and go up into the mountains and have your own mystical experiences. And of course, since then we've participated in peyote ceremonies, and we did a whole junket that I dragged this poor girl along on down into the jungles of Brazil to drink ayahuasca.
Yeah, we have some people in Sarasota who are doing that. You wouldn't know, they were just like common citizens like you, and talking to them one day, we have an ayahuasca circle.
And we have our own film that we made of that journey. It's an hour-long film called The Wisdom of the Serpent, and I'd be happy to get you a copy of that. We have it on DVD, or we have it on VHS, and we're going to be printing up the DVDs. Our son went along with that. He was the emergency medical technician, the EMT, as we went through the Amazon jungle where there were poisonous snakes and hazards everywhere, and we all had to keep our wits about us. Wow. We took some 40, 50 people into the jungle with us and experienced it.
More than half of whom actually were physicians, right?
No, there were at least 10 doctors on the trip, and you'll see it if you look at that. And then we also visited psychic surgeons in in Rio de Janeiro,
Yep.
and people who were doing magical stuff like that. I mean, when you're out of the North American, rather constipated, rather arrogant culture zone, you're in a place of magic and synchronicity and things that happen all the time. I found this when I was hanging out with Hispanics, found this with people in South America, Guatemala, India, Japan. People are just like open to these magical coincidences that are happening all the time. And they are there, and they're even there in stuffy, afflicted North America, where Christianity is kind of calcified into
dollar bills.
Fundamentalism and
Right.
a shallow, type of religiosity.
Do's and don'ts.
Yep.
Yeah, as I call them, the rules.
But there are breakthroughs everywhere, and there are charismatic and virtually shamanic movements or surges even in contemporary Christianity in North America.
Yeah.
It doesn't stay buried long, and the fascinating thing you find in Brazil, as in Sri Lanka and all over, is not only is the shamanic or animistic level that there with the uneducated people, or the people who are closer perhaps to Native American origins in many cases, but it's also there in highly educated people. I mean, Brazil is a very literate people, and taxi cab drivers in Brazil are reading books written by Stan Groff, translated into Spanish. They read Steve's books. You go in the airline, in the airport, bookstore there, instead of having all these political thrillers, has spiritual books.
Yes.
And so the level of
When I got to
literacy
Brazil, I
and
found I was famous. When I was in Spain, I realized that my shamanic books had been published in Spain or in Spanish. I thought, wow, I can read this in Spanish. This is cool, And same thing in Portugal and Brazil. People said, "Oh, you are Esteban Larsen. You are the great mythologist."
And you should tell him how we got to take that group of docs and people into the jungle. It was it Stan Groff, or was who would ask?
Well, Stan Groff, by the way, is going to be at Omega this weekend. I want to go over there. And
Tell us
see
who
him.
Stan Groff is for those of us in the viewing audience who are mystified.
Stan Groff is the Czech psychiatrist who really almost like single-handedly brought clinical LSD and psychedelic studies to the Western Hemisphere. In Czechoslovakia, where they're much more open to the idea that the therapist himself has to take the medicines.
Yes.
Yes. And he opened his knowledge, he opened his spirit, his knowing there. Then he came to this country and he got a job at Maryland Psychiatric Research Center, where I worked with him in the 1970s, and we gave psilocybin and LSD to people dying of cancer, to mental patients, to kind of help them through things, and it was just an amazing kind of experience. So I've kept in contact with Stan. I was part of his training program for mental health professionals at Maryland Psychiatric, and it was very interesting because we took LSD in a clinical setting. You had to be interviewed by 4 psychiatrists. You had to take psychological batteries of tests before they would give you this very high dose Sandoz LSD. And we had 2 sitters. One of them was Stan, one of them was a nurse named Nancy, and we would be in a session, and I would go, "Oh, Stan, I've just been journeying out of my body through Maryland Psychiatric Research Center. And did you know that receptionist out there is being screwed by one of the doctors? And did you know that people are having sex in the back rooms around here? Dr. Curlin doesn't know what's going on." And this Sam go, "Shh, shh, Stephen, you could say that a little bit later." He's a monolithic 6'4" Czech guy who is just he's brilliant, and he goes, "Yes, don't mention anything about that. I think it'd be good if we put a lid on that right now," because I was seeing everything that was going on. I was peering into the collective unconscious of the Psychiatric Research Center, and it was really quite wonderful. And in those days, we were hanging out with Richard Alpers, Ram Dass. He came to this farm, as did Joseph Campbell, as did Stan Groff. They were all our house guests and people that came here. Stan then, after he left Maryland Psychiatric, went into residence at Esalen Institute.
Yes.
And we introduced him to Joseph Campbell, and Joseph became the best man at the marriage of Stan Groff and Joan Halifax, which lasted about 4 stormy years and fell apart. We loved them both, but together they were like...
both powerful and magical,
Yeah.
very healing people.
Yeah.
Now Roshi Joan Halifax. And
Yes.
she has her own place in New Mexico.
Ah, okay.
So, and it was Stan who suggested to Steve, I believe, that he take this group, this specific group of doctors and other people into the Amazon to go to Mafia.
That takes some nerve, doesn't it?
He took me aside at a conference that we were at in California, and he said, Stephen, do you think you could arrange anything for the people that are coming to my international transpersonal conference? He talks this way. He said, do you think you could make arrangements for people to get some ayahuasca in the jungle? And I said, I'll see what I can do, Stan. As a matter of fact, there's a guy named Guilherme Barcelos who was in the group that we're leading, the shamanic group that I was leading with Bradford Keeney. Bradford Keeney is a good friend of mine, long-term. He's one of the great white shamans of our time. He has been initiated. Bradford Keeney. He's been initiated in Australia, Africa. He also works with Credo Mutwa, the African shaman that I work with, and in Japan, in Southeast Asia. He's written about 10 volumes on the shamans of the world. It's really quite fascinating.
And he is really a wonderful person to work with. Really
You have a network of people that has just happened over the 50 years since I last saw you at Columbia. As I left, you were still there for a while, and then I remember that I seen you just sporadically in New York. But then this whole thing started as soon as you began to move into here, right? It probably started earlier.
I married this woman here who is a creative artist and really wonderfully supportive, and we just became best friends, and we journeyed everywhere together.
That's the amazing thing, and I wanted to say something about your work, which Joan, she's one of the great art eyes in the world. She ran a gallery for many years of all the top painters. So she was the only gallery owner who would say, yes, and they all adored her because she had that intuitive, empathic ability to spot the genius in her work. But she loved those boxes, which I did too. She took a look at your boxes today in the living room. She was yakking to me all about them as we went out to get some Gatorade, had a little break.
I do have slides, some...
We want to see a lot of that.
I'd love to show you.
Yeah, because when she gets excited, then I know that we're on to the real thing. She has a great ear and eye for poetry. It's infallible, and a great ear and eye for art. Music's not too good. I don't know what happened to her, although she too much Pete Seeger.
Yes, I'm a fan of songs.
Our parents were communists, So it was a road about ashore, just too much Pete Seeger, too much Pete Seeger.
Well, Pete's important.
I know, we're not going to knock Pete, but there's too much Pete Seeger in Pete Seeger. That's a great line in that movie about Howard Hughes, where there's one of the friends of Katharine Hepburn. He asked her, well, how is your romance going with Howard Hughes? She said, well, it's fine, but the real problem is there's too much Howard Hughes in Howard Hughes, He was always flying the plane, and he was always doing something. So there's too much Pete Seeger in Pete Seeger.